The moment Sadie Bancroft heard the shot ring out across the dry canyon, she did not flinch, and that alone told her more about herself than 23 years of living in Redemption Creek, Texas had ever managed to. It was the summer of 1882, and the town of Redemption Creek sat like a stubborn seed in the cracked red earth of West Texas, refusing to die no matter how hard the sun tried to kill it. The main street was a crooked spine of weathered storefronts, a livery stable that smelled of horses and old hay, a saloon called the Copper Spur that was always louder than it had any business being, and at the far end, past the sheriff's office and the telegraph post, the Bancroft General Store, which Sadie's father, Phineas Bancroft, had built with his own hands in 1869. Sadie had grown up behind that counter. She knew the weight of flour sacks and the smell of dried tobacco, and the way the afternoon light came through the western window and turned everything the color of warm honey. She knew the names of every rancher within 30 miles, every farmer's wife, every drifter who passed through and bought a tin of peaches before moving on. She was not a woman who was easily surprised, but Phineas Covington had surprised her from the very first afternoon. He rode into Redemption Creek on a dusty black quarter horse with a bedroll tied to the back of his saddle, and the kind of jaw that looked like it had been carved out of the same red sandstone as the canyon walls behind the town. He had come in on a Wednesday in late April, and Sadie had been sweeping the front porch of the store when he rode past. He did not look at her. That was the first thing she noticed. Every man who rode down the main street of Redemption Creek looked at Sadie Bancroft, not because she was the most beautiful woman in the county, though she was certainly pretty, with her dark copper hair and her pale green eyes and the dusting of freckles across the bridge of her nose, but because she was Phineas Bancroft's daughter, and Phineas Bancroft owned half the dry goods in 3 counties. Looking at Sadie was, in most men's minds, looking at a future worth considering. Phineas Covington had not looked at her. He had ridden straight to the sheriff's office, tied his horse to the post outside, walked in, and come out again 20 minutes later with a piece of paper in his hand and an expression on his face that told exactly nobody what he was thinking. He had ridden then to the far edge of town, where a narrow road curved south toward the abandoned Harlow Ranch, and he had disappeared. Sadie had gone on sweeping. She found out through the ordinary machinery of small-town conversation, which was to say, she found out through Mrs. Cordelia Finch at the post office, that Phineas Covington had purchased the Harlow place for a sum that made even Phineas Bancroft raise his eyebrows, and that he intended to run cattle on the 1,200 acres of rough pasture that surrounded the old stone house. He was 27 years old, had come from somewhere east of the Pecos, and had no family that anyone could find record of. He paid his debts in cash, spoke only when he had something worth saying, and had already, within his first 2 weeks, repaired the broken fence line along the south pasture and hired 2 hands from across the ridge. He came into the store for the first time on a Thursday morning in early May. Sadie was behind the counter tallying a delivery receipt when the bell above the door announced him, and she looked up to find him standing in the entrance, hat in hand, looking at the shelves with the careful, methodical attention of a man who never bought anything he did not need. He was taller than she had judged from a distance, broad in the shoulders, lean everywhere else. He wore a plain cotton shirt, dark trousers, and boots that had seen considerable use. His hair was dark, almost black, and his eyes, when he finally turned them in her direction, were a shade of gray that reminded her of the sky just before a serious storm. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," Sadie replied. "Can I help you find something? Horseshoe nails if you carry them, 50-pound sack of oats, 3 yards of hemp rope, and a bottle of linseed oil." She had every one of those things. She wrote out the total, quoted it to him, and he paid without haggling, which was unusual enough that she took note of it. He picked up the heavier items himself without asking, which she had not expected to be as irritating as it was. She had been about to offer to have one of the boys load it onto his wagon, but he was already out the door before she found the words. The irritation surprised her. She was not generally irritated by men being capable. But there was something about the self-sufficiency of Phineas Covington that felt less like competence and more like a deliberate wall, a careful construction designed to ensure that no one ever felt they had done him a single favor. He came back the following week and the week after that. He was always prompt, always knew exactly what he needed, always paid in cash and never lingered. He would nod at her father if Elias was behind the counter, exchange a word or two about the weather or the state of the roads, and leave. With Sadie he was polite but contained, as though he was measuring out his words the way you measured out expensive medicine, a little at a time, only as much as strictly necessary. She told herself it did not interest her. She told herself this with decreasing conviction as June arrived, and the heat settled over Redemption Creek like a wool blanket no one had asked for. The moment that changed something, she could never quite pin down what, exactly, changed happened on a Tuesday afternoon when a summer storm came rolling in from the northwest without much warning. Sadie was on the porch again, watching the sky turn that particular shade of purple-green that meant serious weather, when Phineas Covington came riding hard down the main street. He pulled up sharply in front of the store, threw himself off his horse, and was already tying the animal to the post when a tremendous crack of lightning split the sky directly overhead and the horse screamed and reared, pulling the reins clean out of his hands. The horse bolted. Sadie, without thinking, dropped off the porch and cut diagonally across the street, moving fast enough to get ahead of the horse before it reached the far end of the block. She spread her arms wide, planted her feet, and spoke to the animal in a low, steady voice. The tone her father had taught her when she was 9 years old, the tone that told a panicked horse that the world was not, in fact, ending. The horse slowed, then stopped, sides heaving, and she caught the trailing rein and held it. She turned to find Phineas Covington standing in the middle of the street in the first heavy drops of rain, looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. It was not quite surprise, but it was something close to it, a kind of recalibration, as though he was adjusting his understanding of something important. "Thank you," he said. It came out without hesitation, but she could hear the weight of it, as though the two words cost him more than he'd expected. "She's all right," Sadie said, handing him the reins. "Just startled. You should get her into the livery before the worst of it hits." He took the reins. Their fingers did not quite touch, but very nearly, and Sadie was aware of that nearness in a way she found distinctly inconvenient. "I know," he said. Then, after a pause that had a texture to it, "I didn't expect you to move that fast." "People usually don't," she said pleasantly, and walked back to the porch and inside before the rain became a full downpour. She stood behind the counter with her heart doing something unnecessary and told herself very firmly that catching a man's horse was not a romantic event. She did not entirely believe herself. The summer deepened. Phineas Covington's cattle operation, it became clear to everyone in Redemption Creek, was not the modest venture they had initially supposed. He had purchased 60 head to begin with, but by July he had acquired another 40, and there were quiet discussions at the Copper Spur about where exactly a 27-year-old man had come by the kind of capital required to do all of this so cleanly and quickly. Some said he was a gambler. Some said he had inheritance money. A few said there was something suspicious about a man who paid cash for everything and volunteered nothing about his past. Sadie found she had no patience for the speculation. She had her own questions about Phineas Covington, but she was self-aware enough to recognize that her questions were different in nature from the saloon gossip. She was not wondering where his money came from. She was wondering why, on the 3 occasions she had seen him laugh, once at something her father said, once at a mule that had sat down in the middle of the road and refused to move, and once at a hand of cards during the 4th of July festivities. The laughter had transformed his face so completely that he seemed like an entirely different person, someone warmer and less carefully constructed, someone she found herself wanting to know. She was also wondering why, every time he came into the store, his eyes found her first. He was not obvious about it. She suspected most people would not notice. But she noticed, because she was watching for it, and she hated that she was watching for it. The 4th of July celebrations brought most of Redemption Creek's population into the main street for the afternoon and evening. There were tables set up outside the church with food that various women had been preparing since the previous week. A fiddle player from the McReady Ranch who could make even a sad song sound like a reason to dance, and a competition at the far end of the street involving the throwing of horseshoes that Sadie entered every year and had won 4 times in the past 6. She was lining up her second throw in the final round when she became aware that someone had moved to stand at the edge of the small crowd watching the competition. She did not look. She threw. The horseshoe rang cleanly against the stake, and the small crowd made the appreciative noise that small crowds make when they have witnessed something done precisely right. She turned to collect her next horseshoe and found Phineas Covington standing 5 feet away with his hat pushed back and his arms crossed, watching her with the focused attention of a man who is genuinely impressed but has decided not to show it by more than about 30%. "Nice throw," he said. "I've had practice," she said. Clearly, he paused. "Your father tells me you've been winning this competition since you were 17. She glanced over at the refreshment table where Phineas Bancroft was holding a tin cup of lemonade and pretending not to observe this conversation with tremendous interest. "He talks too much," she said. "He's proud of you," Phineas said. "Nothing wrong with that." There was something in the way he said it, simple, direct, with no irony, that made her look at him properly. He was not flirting, he was just saying a true thing. She found this more disarming than any amount of practice charm would have been. "Do you compete?" she asked. "No. Horseshoes." "Roping, the foot race?" "No to all 3. He said it without apology, the way he said most things. "Why not?" He considered for a moment. "I don't enjoy competing for the pleasure of other people watching." "Then why are you watching me?" she asked, and she kept her voice entirely level. The pause before he answered was a half-second longer than it should have been. "I don't know yet," he said. Sadie picked up her horseshoe and threw it. It rang against the stake so hard the sound carried all the way to the church steps. She won the competition, which she had expected. What she had not expected was to find that the watching, when she looked for it again, had continued for the rest of the afternoon. August arrived with its full weight of heat and dust, and with it came a problem that disrupted the comfortable rhythms of Redemption Creek in a way that would eventually pull Phineas Covington and Sadie Bancroft together by routes neither of them had anticipated. The problem was water. The summer of 1882 was a dry one across West Texas, drier than the previous 2 years, and the creek that gave Redemption Creek its name had dropped to a thin trickle by the middle of the month. The ranchers who relied on it began to feel the pressure first. Cattle needed water. Crops needed water. The town's wells were still holding, but the ranches on the southern edge of the county were suffering. Phineas Covington's land was among those worst affected, because the Harlow place sat at the end of a natural drainage channel that depended on the creek staying healthy. When it didn't, the channel dried up, and he was left hauling water to his stock in a way that was sustainable for a week but not for a season. He did not come to anyone for help. Of course he didn't. Sadie had learned enough about him by August to know that asking for help was, for Phineas Covington, roughly as natural as flying. He had a deep and abiding faith in his own ability to solve his own problems, and while she found this admirable in a general philosophical sense, it had begun to seem to her less like strength and more like a kind of stubbornness that was going to cost him something eventually. She was at the store on a hot Friday morning when he came in, and she could see at once that things were not going well. He was dusty in a way that suggested he had already been up and working for many hours, and there was a tension around his eyes and jaw that she had not seen before, a controlled worry. the expression of a man who is doing the arithmetic on a problem and not liking the numbers he keeps arriving at. He bought what he needed wound dressing for one of his horses, she noticed, which meant he had an animal with a cut on top of everything else, and was turning to go when she said, without having planned to say it, "The Bancroft property has a spring." He stopped, turned back. "North quarter section," she said. "My father uses it for the back pasture when we run our own stock, but we're not running anything back there this season. The spring's good and deep. It hasn't failed in the 30 years my family has owned the property." He looked at her for a moment. "Is your father offering?" he asked carefully. "My father doesn't know I'm mentioning it," she admitted, "but he will say yes." "I know him." Something moved across his face that she could not fully read. "I don't take charity," he said. She had expected this. She kept her voice pleasant and reasonable. "It isn't charity, it's neighboring. There's a difference, Mr. Covington, even if you've decided not to recognize it." His jaw tightened. "I'll manage on my own." "You may," she said. "Or you may lose cattle you spent considerable money acquiring and set your operation back by a year or two. And all because you couldn't stand the thought of asking someone for the use of a spring they're not currently using. That seems like an expensive kind of pride." The word pride landed between them like a stone in still water, and she watched the ripples of it move across his expression. He did not answer her immediately. He picked up his package from the counter, held it, and looked at her with those storm-gray eyes in a way that made the air between them feel like it had weight. "I'll think about it," he said at last. He left. Sadie stood behind the counter and breathed out slowly and told herself that was probably the most she was ever going to get from him on the subject. She went to her father that evening and told him what she had done. Phineas Bancroft was a broad, weathered man of 55, with a white beard and hands that bore the marks of 3 decades of hard work. He sat at the kitchen table of the house attached to the back of the store and listened to his daughter with the patient attention he gave to everything she said, which was one of the things she loved most about him. When she finished, he said, "You told him about the North Spring." "I did. Without asking me. I knew what you'd say." He looked at his tin cup for a moment. "You were right, I'd say yes." He looked up at her. "You're fond of him." "I think he's going to be a good neighbor if he survives long enough," Sadie said carefully. Phineas Bancroft smiled into his cup. He was a man who knew his daughter very well, and he understood the significant territory she was not covering with that sentence. "I'll send word to Covington in the morning. Tell him the spring is available at no charge and that I won't hear any argument about it." "Thank you, Papa." "You're welcome." He paused. "He's a proud one, that man." "I know," she said. "The proud ones fall the hardest," her father said mildly and went back to his cup. Sadie went to bed and lay awake longer than she wanted to, watching the square of moonlight move across her bedroom floor, trying not to think about storm-gray eyes and the particular quality of 2 words, "thank you," spoken by a man who was not accustomed to saying them. Phineas Covington came to the North Spring 3 days later, after what Sadie gathered had been a period of internal struggle that Elias had navigated with the practical diplomacy of a man who had been dealing with difficult customers for 30 years. Her father had not framed it as a favor. He had framed it as an arrangement between neighbors that benefited them. Both Covington's cattle would keep the grass around the spring crop down, which benefited the pasture, and Covington's presence on the property occasionally would discourage the small-time rustlers who had been testing the edges of Bancroft land for 2 summers running. It was, Sadie thought, exactly the right framing for a man like Phineas Covington, and she felt a surge of affection for her father's quiet intelligence. She saw Covington only at a distance during the first week of the arrangement. She could sometimes see the dust of his cattle moving along the northern pasture road in the early morning, and twice she saw him on horseback checking the fence line, a small dark figure against the enormous pale sky. He was methodical and careful, and she noticed that he spent time repairing sections of Bancroft fence that were not his responsibility to fix, which she interpreted as his version of paying rent. It was on the 9th morning of the arrangement that she went out to the North Spring herself, because one of the 2 Bancroft milk cows had developed a habit of wandering, and she had tracked the animal's trail north. She found the cow placidly drinking from the spring and Phineas Covington sitting on a flat rock nearby, eating something from a cloth-wrapped bundle and looking at the water with the 1,000-yard gaze of a man who has been thinking hard about something for a long time. He looked up when she came through the gap in the live oak trees. He did not look startled. He looked, she thought, as though he had half expected her to appear, and was not certain how he felt about that. "Lost a cow," she said by way of explanation. "I can see that," he said. He looked at the placid animal. "She's been coming up here every morning for a week. I kept meaning to mention it." "I wish you had," Sadie said mildly. "I've been looking for her." "I thought you knew." A pause. That was an assumption. Yes, it was. She sat down on another flat rock not particularly close to him, and the cow turned her head to look at Sadie with enormous bovine indifference before returning to her drinking. "What are you eating?" "Biscuit and dried beef. My cook's away for the week." "Your cook leaves." "He's not a permanent arrangement. He comes twice a week from town." He paused. "I can cook reasonably well. The biscuit was mine." She looked at the biscuit. It looked dense and pale and entirely functional. "Does it taste as serious as it looks?" He glanced down at it and the corner of his mouth moved just slightly, but she was watching for it. "Yes," he said. She laughed. It surprised her a little the way the laugh came out, easy and genuine. And it appeared to surprise him too, because he looked at her with that recalibrating expression again, the one that suggested she kept doing things he had not predicted. "Sadie," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name, and both of them registered the fact. She saw him note it, and she felt the warm, particular weight of hearing her name in his voice. "Yes," she said, keeping herself composed. "I owe you an apology. You mentioned this spring to me at some personal risk. You hadn't cleared it with your father, and I was short with you. I didn't thank you the way I should have." She watched him. This was costing him something. She could see it in the careful straightness of his posture, the deliberate steadiness of his gaze. He was not a man who revisited difficult moments voluntarily, and yet here he was doing exactly that. "The spring helped," she said. "That's enough." "It isn't actually," he said. "I've thought about what you said, about the difference between charity and neighboring." He looked at the water for a moment. "You were right. I've been drawing that line in the wrong place for a long time." It was, she thought, probably the most honest thing she had heard a man say in quite some time. She felt something settle in her chest, some small warmth that had been tentative and uncertain becoming slightly more confident. "You're not wrong to value independence," she said, "but independence doesn't mean you have to build every wall alone." He looked at her directly. "No," he said, "I'm beginning to understand that." They sat by the spring for another half hour, and they talked. Not about anything of tremendous consequence. The state of the summer range. The new telegraph line that was supposed to reach Redemption Creek by September. The question of whether the town needed a second doctor. But they talked the way people talk when they are discovering for the first time that conversation with a particular person is something they have, without knowing it, been wanting. She learned that he had grown up in Virginia, that his father had been a difficult man in the particular way that men of a certain era and temperament were difficult, which was to say largely absent and rigidly demanding when present. She learned that he had come west at 22 with enough money from a sold land parcel to buy a stake in a cattle operation outside Abilene, that the operation had succeeded, that he had sold his stake at 25 for a profit, and spent 2 years looking for the right piece of land before finding the Harlow place. He did not say much about the years between 22 and 27, but she noticed the gaps and did not push. She understood that he would fill them in time, or he wouldn't, and either way, what he had chosen to offer was more than she had expected from him in any conversation up to this point. She told him about growing up in the store, about learning accounts before she learned her full alphabet, about the way her mother had died of fever when Sadie was 12, and how she had stepped gradually and naturally into the management of the household, because her father had needed her too. She told him about the year she had spent in San Antonio at 19, working in a dry goods house to learn the wholesale side of the business, and about the particular homesickness she had felt, not for any person, but for the specific quality of the Redemption Creek light in the early morning. "You came back," he said. "I always intended to. Most people don't when they get out." "Most people don't have a father like mine," she said simply, and meant it in all the ways it could be meant. He nodded slowly. There was something in his face when she talked about her father, an attentiveness, a kind of careful respect that she noted and kept. The cow, evidently satisfied with the morning's water, turned and began ambling back toward the Bancroft property. Sadie stood, brushing dust from her skirt, and Phineas stood too, in that automatic, reflexive way of a man raised with certain manners that had survived even his most deliberately self-sufficient years. "I'll walk you back to the road," he said. "You don't have to." "I know," he said. "I want to." The walk back to the road through the pale, dry grass of the north pasture was quiet but not uncomfortable. She was aware of him beside her, the sound of his footfall, the slight shadow he cast to the east in the morning light. She was aware, too, that he was aware of her in the same calibrated, careful way, and that neither of them was quite ready to say anything about it. At the road's edge, where the pasture grass gave way to the rutted track that led back to town, he stopped. She stopped too, and they stood for a moment with the enormous West Texas sky overhead, and the hot wind moving through the grass in the long, patient way it moved through everything out here. "Thank you," he said. And this time, she thought, it came a little more naturally. September arrived on a wave of change. The telegraph line reached Redemption Creek a week ahead of schedule, and with it came a new connection to the wider world that the town found both exciting and slightly alarming. There was news from the east, news from the territories, news about cattle prices and railroad expansion, and the ongoing complications of Reconstruction politics filtering slowly westward. For Phineas Covington, the telegraph brought a message that Sadie learned about only indirectly, through the way his expression changed on the two occasions she saw him during the first week of the month. There was something weighing on him. She could see it in the set of his shoulders and the distracted quality of his attention when he came into the store and bought supplies in his usual efficient way, but with slightly less of his usual presence, as though a significant portion of his thinking was somewhere else entirely. She did not ask. It was not yet her place to ask, but she thought about it. The shift happened on a September evening when the air had finally cooled enough to make sitting outside after supper pleasant, and Sadie was on the porch of the house with her father, watching the stars come out over the canyon when they heard hoofbeats on the road and Phineas Covington came riding up the lane. Phineas Bancroft stood up. Sadie stayed where she was. Covington dismounted and came to the porch steps and took off his hat. "Evening, Mr. Bancroft." "Miss Bancroft." He looked at her father. "I'm sorry to come at this hour. I need to ask your advice about something if you're willing." Her father's eyebrows went up very slightly, but he was a man of excellent social instincts. "Of course," he said. "Come up and sit down." Covington sat in the spare chair. Sadie poured him a cup of coffee from the pot her father kept going on summer evenings, and he took it with a nod of thanks that was slightly more natural than it would have been 3 months ago. "The telegraph message I received last week," he said. "It was from a lawyer in Virginia. My father has died." A small silence settled over the porch. "I'm sorry for your loss," Elias said in the genuine and uncomplicated way he had. "Thank you." Covington looked at his coffee cup. "We were not close. I won't pretend otherwise, but his death has complicated something. There's a piece of land in Virginia, a small farm, not particularly valuable, that he left to me. The lawyer says I need to either claim it and pay the associated taxes and fees, or decline it in writing. The fees to claim it are significant, enough that I'm not sure I can both manage them and maintain the operational costs here through the winter." He said this with the particular flatness of a man who finds it difficult to discuss money problems, and has decided that directness, is the only honorable approach to something he'd rather not discuss at all. Sadie recognized the effort it cost him. She recognized it because she had been watching him carefully enough by now to know the difference between his natural containment and the slightly more rigid posture he adopted when he was doing something that was genuinely hard for him. He was asking for advice. He was asking her father, a man he respected, whose opinion he valued, for help thinking through a problem. He had ridden out in the evening, after dark was almost fully settled, because the question had been weighing on him long enough that he needed to talk it out with someone, and the someone he had chosen was Phineas Bancroft. Sadie sat very still in her chair and felt something turn over in her chest, something large and significant, like a stone that had been resting in one position for a long time finally settling into a new one. She had thought he was too proud to ever ask for help. She had thought he would carry every weight alone rather than let another person see him struggling with anything. She had thought that the wall he had built around his self-sufficiency was too high and too thick to admit any light. And here he was, hat in his hand in the evening dark, asking for help. She listened while her father talked through the situation with him, the practical questions about the value of the Virginia property, the costs of claiming versus declining, the winter operational requirements of the Covington cattle operation. Her father was good at this kind of thinking. He had 30 years of running a business in a hard country, and he approached financial problems the way he approached everything else, with steadiness and without alarm. By the end of the conversation, he had suggested that Covington contact the Virginia lawyer and ask for a 3-month extension on the decision, which was legally permissible, and use that time to get a proper valuation of the Virginia property to determine whether claiming it made financial sense. He also offered, quietly and without making much of it, to extend Covington's account at the store for the winter months at no interest. Covington was quiet for a moment. "I'll pay interest," he said. "You won't," Phineas said pleasantly. "It's a neighbor arrangement. You've been doing work on my fence line that I haven't charged you for. We'll call it even." Covington looked at him for a long moment, and Sadie watched something in him shift and settle, the way it had by the spring, as though he was learning again, slowly and with some resistance, that accepting help did not make him smaller. "Thank you, Mr. Bancroft," he said. "I mean it." "I know you do," Phineas said. "Now drink your coffee. Sadie made it strong the way you like it." Covington glanced at her then, quickly, and she realized her father had revealed something she had not consciously planned to reveal, which was that she had noticed and remembered how he took his coffee. The warmth that rose in her face was, she hoped, hidden by the evening dark. "She pays attention," Covington said, and she could hear something in his voice that she had not heard before, a careful tenderness, like a man holding something he is not entirely sure he is allowed to hold. "She always has," Phineas said, and drank his own coffee with the expression of a man who is deeply and entirely pleased with the way an evening has gone. October came, and with it the first cooling and a shift in the quality of the light that Sadie had always loved, the way the afternoons turned golden and long, and the shadows got interesting again after the flat harshness of summer. The cattle on the range began to do better with the cooler temperatures and the grass that was making one last effort before winter. The spring in the north pasture was still running strong. Phineas Covington began coming to supper. It was a gradual thing. It started with Elias running into him at the copper spur on a cold Tuesday evening and bringing him back to the house for a meal, and then it happened again the following week, and then again. And by the 3rd week of October, it had settled into something regular without anyone having formally arranged it, which was, Sadie thought, exactly how the best things happened. He would arrive in the early evening, still dusty from the day's work, and wash at the pump in the yard, and come in and help her father move whatever piece of furniture or barrel or crate Elias had been meaning to shift for 2 weeks, and then they would sit at the table and eat and talk. And Sadie would cook because she was a genuinely good cook, and she had no patience for pretending otherwise. and the conversation would run from cattle prices to local politics to books, she discovered. With considerable pleasure, that he had read widely and thought carefully about what he read and back again. He helped with the dishes without being asked after the third supper. She noticed he was careful not to make a thing of it, just rose and carried plates to the basin, the same way he would carry anything that needed carrying, matter-of-factly, as though it had never occurred to him that doing the dishes was not what men did after supper. She liked this about him more than she could have anticipated. There were moments in those October evenings that she would keep. The way he told a story spare and precise, but with a dry wit that only revealed itself if you were paying close attention, which she was. The way he looked at her father when Elias said something wise, with that particular expression of a man who is in the presence of something he did not have in his own growing up and is feeling the absence of it freshly, not with bitterness, but with a kind of grateful recognition. The way he would sometimes catch her eye across the table when her father said something particularly good, a quick shared glance, the private language of two people who have begun to understand each other. She was in love with him. She understood this clearly and without great drama on an evening in late October when he was helping her carry firewood in from the yard, and she handed him a log and their hands briefly overlapped and the ordinary world went slightly sideways for about 3 seconds and she thought, oh, of course. How long has that been true? A while, she admitted to herself. A good while. She did not know what to do with this information. It was 1882 in West Texas, and she was a woman and there were rules, some of them spoken and some not, about what women did with feelings of this kind. She knew there were women who were bolder than convention, and she had always considered herself relatively forthright, but there was a particular vulnerability in this case that made her cautious. She had seen the careful way he held himself. She had seen the wall he had built. She did not know, with certainty, whether what she felt was returned, and the uncertainty mattered to her because she was not a woman who did things halfway. If she walked toward this, she intended to walk toward it all the way, and she was not willing to do that without more surety than she presently had. So she waited. She watched. She had, as her father said, always paid attention. November arrived cold and early, with frost on the ground by the 5th of the month, and a cutting north wind that swept down off the Llano Estacado and reminded everyone in Redemption Creek that winter in West Texas was not to be treated as a mild inconvenience. The day that changed everything between them fell on the 12th of November, a gray and bitter Saturday. Sadie was at the store managing the morning trade. Saturday was always busy, with ranchers and farmers coming in for the week's supplies, when one of Covington's ranch hands came in with a message. His name was Diego Reyes, a compact and dependable young man of 20 who had been with Covington since the spring, and his expression when he came through the door told her something was wrong before he opened his mouth. "Miss Bancroft," he said, "Mr. Covington's been hurt." She was already reaching for her coat. "How badly?" "He's on his feet. A section of fence collapsed while he was working on it. One of the posts came down and caught his left arm. He sent me into town for the doctor, but Dr. Haverhill is out at the Morrison place and won't be back till this evening. Mr. Covington says it's fine, says to tell anyone who asks that it's nothing, but Diego paused. He's going pale, ma'am, and he keeps stopping what he's doing to breathe through his teeth." "That's not nothing," Sadie said. She told her father, who was in the back tallying inventory, where she was going. She took the medical tin her father kept behind the counter, not a doctor's kit, but a solid collection of clean cloth, antiseptic, and the kind of practical wound care that frontier life made necessary, and she rode with Diego to the Covington property in the cold gray morning. She found Phineas Covington in his barn, sitting on a hay bale, trying to wrap his own left forearm with his right hand, and not making much progress. He looked up when she came in, and she could see at once that Diego had been right. He was pale beneath the weathering, and there was a tightness around his mouth that told her the pain was considerable. "You didn't need to come," he said. "No," she agreed pleasantly, setting down the tin and opening it. "Let me see." He didn't argue, which she took as evidence that it hurt more than he was letting on. She sat beside him on the hay bale and unwrapped what he had managed to do, which was not much. The cut was long 6 or 7 inches along the outside of his forearm, and had gone through to muscle in one section. It needed cleaning, and it needed to be closed properly. She cleaned it, which required him to make a controlled and quiet sound that told her a good deal about his pain tolerance, and then she closed the worst section with the butterflied strips of cloth she had learned to use from her father, who had learned from a field surgeon decades earlier. It was not as good as proper suturing would have been, but Dr. Haverhill could improve on it this evening. Throughout all of this, he was very still and very quiet, and she was close enough to him that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold barn, and she was focused on the wound and the work, and then she looked up and found him looking at her with an expression that had nothing restrained in it at all. It was not a look she had seen from him before. All of the careful construction was gone. He was simply looking at her with everything he had been so meticulously holding back for the past 7 months, and there was no way to misread it, no possible interpretation that led anywhere except the one that made her heart do the thing it had been doing since May, but with considerably more conviction. "Sadie," he said. His voice was different, lower, stripped of its usual armor. "Almost done," she said. Her own voice was not entirely steady. "I need to tell you something." She tied off the last strip of cloth. She made herself look at him properly. "All right," she said. "I have been trying," he said, "for the better part of 5 months to talk myself out of being in love with you. I want to say that clearly because I have not." He stopped, looked at his bandaged arm, looked back at her. "I have not handled any of this particularly well. I'm not good at this. I know that. But I'm in love with you, and I can't keep not saying it." The barn was silent except for the horse in the nearest stall moving softly and the wind against the wooden walls. Sadie looked at him for a long moment, at the pale, honest, open face of the most carefully guarded man she had ever met, and she felt the full and wonderful weight of everything he had just done. "You've been trying to talk yourself out of it," she said. "Yes. How has that been going?" The corner of his mouth moved. "Badly," he said. "Very badly." She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, and he went very still, the way his horse had gone still by the fence post in the storm. His eyes were that storm gray in the dim barn light, and they were looking at her with something that was not quite disbelief but close to it, the expression of a man who is receiving something he had convinced himself he had no right to want. "I've been in love with you," she said, "since approximately the day I found out you were fixing my father's fence without anyone asking you to, which was sometime in September." He put his hand over hers, the one that was still at his jaw, and held it there. "I'll fix fence all the way to the county line," he said, and his voice had something in it that was almost humor and something that was entirely not. She laughed, and he bent his head and kissed her, and it was, like everything about him, careful and unhurried and absolutely certain, the kiss of a man who does not do anything he hasn't fully committed to. The weeks that followed were a careful renegotiation of everything, the way they were with each other, the way they moved through the world of Redemption Creek, the way the town understood what they were becoming to one another. It was a small town, and small towns have their own way of absorbing a courtship. The raised eyebrows, the approving nods, Mrs. Cordelia Finch's barely contained delight at the post office every time a letter from the Covington property was addressed in care of the Bancroft store. Phineas was not transformed by love the way men in certain stories are transformed. He did not suddenly become expansive and outgoing and free with his words. He remained himself, contained and precise and occasionally frustrating in his economy of expression. But he was differently himself. The wall was still there, but she could see over it now, and he led her over it, which was the thing that mattered. He held her hand when they walked. He thought about what she had said the previous time and responded to it the next time, as though he had been turning it over in the interim. He asked her opinion about the cattle operation, about the Virginia property decision. He had declined the land in the end, finding that the costs outweighed the value and that Virginia held nothing he wanted to return to about the winter plans. He included her in his thinking, which was its own kind of intimacy. And he was gentle with her in a way she had not expected from a man built the way he was built, not fragile, but careful, the way someone careful with a thing because they understand its value. December settled over Redemption Creek with a quietness that was almost peaceful, and the question that had been moving between Phineas Covington and Sadie Bancroft since November began to take on a shape, a specific and serious shape. He did not ask her directly, not immediately. What he did first was something that she would not discover until later, and which, when she found out about it, would reorganize everything she thought she knew about him into a new and more complete picture. She found out on a Tuesday evening in the second week of December when she came home from the store earlier than usual to find that her father was not in the kitchen or the front room or out by the wood pile. She found him eventually in the small parlor that they used for formal occasions and for conversations requiring privacy, a room that smelled of old paper and her mother's dried flowers, still kept in a ceramic jar on the mantel after 11 years. Phineas Covington was in the parlor with him. She had not heard Covington arrive. His horse, she realized, was not at the front post but must have been taken to the barn side, which was why she had missed it. The parlor door was not fully closed, and she heard her father's voice low and serious, the voice he used when he was saying something he had thought about for a while, and then she heard Covington's voice. She could not make out the words clearly at first. She stood in the hallway, not quite close enough, and then her father said something that made her take 2 steps nearer without thinking, because she heard her own name. She heard Phineas Covington say, with a steadiness that she recognized as costing him something considerable, "I know I'm not the easiest man to understand, sir, and I know she deserves someone who can give her more than I have known how to give. But I am working on that. I believe I am better with her than I am without her, and I intend to spend the rest of my life proving that to her if she'll allow me. But I wanted to ask you first. I respect you, Mr. Bancroft, and I respect her enough to understand that your blessing matters to both of us, whether she knows I'm asking for it tonight or not." The silence that followed was the most significant silence Sadie had ever stood outside of. She pressed her back against the hallway wall, and the breath she took was the kind that happens in the chest before your eyes fill, the deep, involuntary breath of someone who has just heard something they were not prepared for in the best possible way. She had thought he was too proud to ever ask for help. She had watched him struggle with every borrowed favor, every offered hand, every practical assistance that the world extended and he reluctantly accepted. She had seen how much it had cost him to come to her father about the spring, about the Virginia property, about the financial arrangements of the winter. She had loved him through all of that resistance, had seen the pride in him clearly enough to name it, had even said the word to his face and watched him sit with it. And here he was, asking her father for permission to marry her, not because he had to, not because convention demanded it, though it certainly suggested it, but because, as he had just said himself, he respected her enough and respected her father enough to do this right, to do it properly, to ask which was the thing that of all things came hardest to him. She listened to her father's voice next, and it was her father at his very best, warm and measured and honest. "I've watched you this year," Elias said. "I've watched how you handle difficulty and how you've been learning slowly and with some protest but genuinely learning how to let people in. And I've watched my daughter with you. I've watched her become, if you'll forgive me saying it, more completely herself. She's always been remarkable, but with you she's—" a pause, and she heard the smile in his voice, "more so." "She is," Covington said, with a simplicity that was not a small thing from him. "You have my blessing," Elias said. "And my advice for nothing. When you ask her, don't make a speech. Say it simply. She values that in you." "I know," Covington said. Sadie pushed herself off the wall and walked as quickly and quietly as she could to her room and stood with her hand over her mouth, breathing through the sighs of what she was feeling. She was not a woman who cried easily, but her eyes were bright, and her chest was full of something enormous and warm. And she understood, standing in her childhood bedroom with the winter dark outside the window, that the man in her father's parlor had just done the bravest thing she had ever known him to do. He had asked for something. He had asked for her. She went to the window and looked out at the December night, at the pale stars above the canyon rim, and she thought about the first morning in April when he had ridden down the main street and not looked at her, and she thought about all the distances they had both crossed to get here, step by step, in the crooked and unplanned way that real things happen. She waited. He came to find her the next evening. He came to the store, which was closing, and stood at the counter until her father disappeared into the back with the excellent instincts of a man who has promised not to be present for a particular conversation. And then Phineas Covington stood across the counter from her with his hat in his hands, and that particular careful steadiness that she had come to understand as his version of full emotional exposure. "Sadie," he said. "Yes," she said. She kept her face composed. This was, she felt, important. He needed to say this himself in his own way without her making it easier than it had to be. Some things needed to be said and said fully, even when they were hard. "I love you," he said. "I've told you that already. What I haven't said is that I want to marry you. I want to be your husband. I want—" He stopped. She could see him selecting words with the careful attention he gave everything. "I want to build something with you, not just the ranch, though that too, something larger than that, a life. I know I am not always easy. I am working on it genuinely because you make me want to be better at it. I would like to spend the time it takes trying to be worthy of you." He stopped. He looked at her across the counter of her father's store, in the late afternoon light that fell through the western window and turned everything the color of warm honey, the same light she had grown up with, the light of the only place she had ever truly called home. "Yes," she said. He blinked. "Just yes." "Just yes," she said. "I have been waiting for you to get here. I was not going to rush you." He came around the counter in 2 strides and she was already moving to meet him, and he put both hands on her face, very gently, and kissed her. And it was different from the barn. It was more than the barn. It was a full and certain thing that tasted like December and resolve and a beginning. When her father appeared in the doorway of the back room approximately 30 seconds later with the carefully managed surprise of a man who has been hovering near a door and can no longer convincingly pretend otherwise, Covington looked over Sadie's head at him and said, with a genuine and uncomplicated happiness that Sadie had never heard from him before, she said yes. Phineas Bancroft smiled so broadly that his white beard seemed to widen with it. "Of course she did," he said. "I raised her to know a good thing when it came to her door." The wedding was planned for early spring, when the weather would be cooperative and the whole of Redemption Creek could attend without freezing, which in West Texas in December was not a trivial consideration. The intervening months were busy with the particular industry of preparing for a life together, and Sadie found, as she moved through those months, that she and Phineas fell naturally into the kind of practical partnership that was, in her experience, rarer and more valuable than the merely romantic kind. He was good with numbers, better than she had known, with a precise and methodical understanding of accounts that complemented her own more intuitive approach to the store's management. She was good with people, a skill that he was genuinely developing, but that did not come naturally to him, and that she could cover in the social moments that required it. He was patient in ways she was not, particularly with animals and with long, repetitive labor. She was faster in ways he was not, particularly with decisions and with the kind of rapid assessment of a situation that the business world required. They had arguments, real ones, not delicate ones. The first significant argument happened in January when she wanted to expand the store's inventory to include a small selection of ready-made women's clothing, which had begun to be manufactured in sufficient quantity to make it commercially viable, and he thought the capital investment was premature. They argued about it for an entire evening at her father's kitchen table, both of them making genuine points, neither of them yielding until they had fully heard the other, and they arrived at a compromise, a smaller initial investment, to be expanded if the first season went well. That was better than either of their original positions. What she noticed, when she thought about it later, was that the argument had not frightened her. She had not wondered if it meant something was wrong, had not performed a careful emotional audit of whether they were still all right. She had been angry at his conservatism in the heat of the moment, and she had said so directly, and he had been frustrated with what he called her tendency to move faster than the ground could support, and he had said so directly, and then they had worked through it, and at the end she had been more confident, not less, in the solidity of what they were building. He was not a man who retreated from conflict. He met it the same way he met everything, head-on, with honesty and a willingness to stay in the room. She found this deeply reassuring in ways she had not known to look for. The wedding was held on the 15th of March, 1883, on a day that opened clear and cold and warmed steadily through the morning until, by the time the ceremony began in the yard beside the church at noon, the sun was genuinely pleasant, and the sky was the particular shade of blue that belonged only to the high desert in early spring. The town turned out almost entirely. Mrs. Cordelia Finch was present with an expression of satisfaction, so complete it seemed almost proprietary. Diego Reyes stood with the other Covington ranch hands near the church fence in their best shirts. The doctor and his wife were there. The minister from the Baptist church 3 miles up the road performed the ceremony because Redemption Creek's own reverend had taken the winter off with a bad knee and wasn't entirely back yet. Phineas Bancroft walked his daughter down the aisle, or rather, down the path of flattened grass between the 2 rows of borrowed chairs set up in the churchyard, with a dignity that came from 30 years of holding himself together through everything, and a joy that was so genuine it was visible from the back row. Phineas Covington stood at the end of that aisle in a dark coat that she suspected was the best piece of clothing he owned, hat in his hand, and he watched her come toward him with an expression that she would keep for the rest of her life, open and certain and without a single wall in it, the face of a man who has decided, completely and irrevocably, to be fully present for what is happening to him. She reached him. He took her hand and his grip was steady. The minister spoke the words. They repeated what was required of them. When the minister asked if she would have this man, she said yes with a clarity that left absolutely no room for interpretation, and she heard a ripple of warmth move through the people gathered behind them that she recognized as the sound of a town that is genuinely glad about something. When the minister gave Phineas permission to kiss his bride, he did so with the contained and certain quality that was, she thought, exactly him, exactly right, and she kissed him back with equal conviction while behind them Phineas Bancroft made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob and was very precisely both. They moved to the Covington property, to the Harlow house, which Phineas had spent the winter making properly habitable, replacing roof boards and fixing windows, and whitewashing the interior walls until the old stone house was not a comfortable frontier dwelling exactly, but was on its way to becoming one. There were things still to be done. There were always things still to be done. Sadie made a list because she was constitutionally incapable of not making lists, and they worked through it together over the spring and summer, the same way they worked through everything, with argument and compromise and the occasional moment of startling agreement that made both of them stop and look at each other. The store remained, as it had always been, Bancroft property, and Sadie continued to manage it, riding into town most mornings and returning in the late afternoon. Phineas never suggested she give it up. He had understood from the beginning that the store was not a job but a part of her, and the thought of asking her to set it aside would not have occurred to him. He sometimes came in on his way through town and sat on the stool behind the counter if the store was quiet, and they talked, and she caught the way her customers looked at them together, the small approving smiles, The relaxed ease of people watching two people who have clearly gotten something exactly right. Spring became summer, and summer brought with it the news that Sadie had been waiting to tell him for 3 weeks because she wanted to be certain before she said it. And she told him on an evening in late June, when the sun was going down behind the canyon rim and painting the sky red and orange. Sitting on the stone step of the house with a cup of tea she was not particularly drinking. "We're going to have a baby," she said. He was beside her on the step, and she felt him go very still in the particular way she had come to know. The way he went still when something was happening to him that he had not fully prepared for and was working to absorb. Then he turned and looked at her, and the expression on his face was so fully open, so entirely unguarded, that she felt her heart do something extravagant. "A baby," he said. "Yes. When? January, I think, perhaps February." He looked at the sunset for a moment. Then he put his arm around her and drew her in close against him, and she leaned into him, and they sat that way in the warm evening air with the canyon turning gold and red below them. And he said, quietly, against her hair, "I did not know I wanted this until this moment." "You didn't have to know yet," she said. "That's what the moment is for." She felt him press his lips to the top of her head, and she closed her eyes, and the evening was very large and very beautiful around them. The summer brought other things too. There was a cattle dispute with a rancher named Hurley who ran stock on the adjacent property and had a habit of finding his fence lines gradually where it suited him. And there was a fairly tense afternoon in July when Phineas and Hurley had words over it in the presence of 2 deputies and the town's sheriff. An efficient man named Castleman, who had been running Redemption Creek's law for 6 years, and was not interested in letting a boundary dispute escalate into something uglier. It was resolved, eventually, through a formal survey conducted in August, which found clearly in Covington's favor, and the fence lines were adjusted accordingly. Sadie had been present for some of these negotiations and absent for others, and she noticed that Phineas, in his dealings with Hurley and with the sheriff, had gotten somewhat better at modulating his directness. He was still direct. He always would be. But he had learned not because she had told him to, but because he had watched and listened and applied the same careful attention to people that he applied to everything else. That there was a difference between honesty and the unmitigated delivery of honesty, and that the gap between them was often the difference between a problem solved and a problem escalated. She told him she was proud of him on the evening after the survey results came in. He looked at her and said, "You've been teaching me things without either of us quite noticing." "You've been a quick study," she said. "I had a good incentive," he said, and smiled at her in the full, uncomplicated way that only she ever got from him, the smile that had very little to do with the contained, careful face he showed the world, and everything to do with what they were to each other. Autumn was gentler in 1883 than the previous year, with decent rains in September that brought the creek up to a proper level and eased the water worries that had haunted the past summer. The Covington cattle operation had grown to nearly 200 head by October, a number that represented a sound and building business, not spectacular wealth but real and solid progress, the kind built on good judgment and consistent work. Phineas Bancroft came to supper at the Covington house 3 evenings a week, a routine that had settled naturally after the wedding. He was, as he had always been, excellent company, and he and Phineas had developed a friendship between them that Sadie watched with a private and particular happiness. They argued about politics and cattle and the proper way to bank a fire for the night, and they agreed about nearly everything else. And Phineas listened to her father the way he listened to very few people, with genuine attention. The attention of someone who recognizes that they are in the presence of accumulated wisdom and takes it seriously. "He's the father I did not have," Phineas told her one evening quietly when Elias had gone home and they were sitting by the fire. "I want you to know I understand what that means. I don't take it lightly." "He loves you," she said. "He wouldn't have given his blessing if he didn't, and he wouldn't keep coming to supper if he didn't." Phineas looked at the fire. "I know," he said. "That's why it matters as much as it does." She took his hand and held it, and they sat together in the firelight, and she thought about the parlor in November, and the careful voice she had stood outside of, the voice of a man asking for something precious. And she thought about how much had followed from that one act of asking, that one moment of setting pride aside in the service of something more important than pride. And she felt, sitting by the fire with his hand in hers and their child growing beneath her heart, that there was very little in the world she needed beyond this. January of 1884 brought the coldest stretch of weather Redemption Creek had seen in a decade. The creek froze for the first time in years, and the canyon walls were hung with ice, and Sadie, who was large with the baby and had slowed considerably in the final weeks, spent most of her time near the fire and found herself surprisingly at peace with the forced stillness of it. She read. She wrote letters. She planned next spring's expansion of the store's ready-made clothing section, which had performed so well in its first season that she and Phineas had agreed in October to double the inventory. Phineas hovered, which she had not expected from him, and which she found alternately endearing and maddening. He was not a hovering man by nature, but pregnancy had apparently activated some previously dormant attentiveness in him that expressed itself through a careful monitoring of whether she had eaten, whether she was warm enough, whether she had what she needed within arm's reach. She told him on the 20th of January, firmly and affectionately, that she was not made of porcelain, that women had been having babies in West Texas for as long as there had been a West Texas, and that she would tell him when she actually needed something. He listened and nodded and brought her another blanket 15 minutes later. She decided this was, on balance, a reasonable way for a person to love someone, and she took the blanket. The baby came on the 3rd of February, a boy, which surprised neither of them particularly since they had both been fairly convinced it was a boy without any rational basis for the conviction. He arrived in the early morning hours with all the drama that first babies reliably bring, and Sadie's labor was hard and long but ultimately uncomplicated, with the doctor present and Phineas Bancroft in the front room wearing a path in the floorboards. When it was done, when the baby was cleaned and wrapped and laid in Sadie's arms, and the first gray light of a February morning was beginning to show in the eastern window, Phineas Covington sat on the edge of the bed beside his wife and looked at the small, red, furious face of his son, and something happened in his own face that Sadie watched with her whole heart. Every wall, every careful construction, every piece of the shell he had built across 27 years of learning to need no one and trust nothing he had not made himself, all of it was simply gone. He looked at his son with the naked, defenseless wonder of a man encountering something entirely outside of his previous experience of the world, something his pride and his independence and his self-sufficiency had not prepared him for and could not manage, something that required nothing of him except to be fully and completely present. "Hello," he said to the baby, and his voice was so quietly extraordinary in its tenderness that she felt it move through her like something warm. "What do we call him?" she asked. He looked at her. They had discussed names but had not settled anything, and she had thought they would decide in the moment when they saw him. "Elias," he said without hesitation, "if that's all right with you." She looked at the baby and then at her husband. "It's more than all right," she said. Phineas Bancroft, when informed in the front room by a doctor who emerged from the bedroom looking thoroughly satisfied with the evening's work, that he had a grandson, and that the grandson was to bear his name, sat down very suddenly in the nearest chair and pressed both hands over his face and made sounds that were entirely inconsistent with his general dignity, and that were, she heard later from the doctor who reported it with enormous approval, completely genuine. Young Phineas Covington turned out to be an enthusiastic and demanding participant in the world from approximately his first week. He was healthy and loud, and possessed of strong opinions about schedules that he communicated with impressive volume. Phineas, who had never had any experience with infants, approached fatherhood the way he approached everything, with methodical attention and a willingness to fail early and learn fast. He walked the baby at night without complaint. He was patient in a way that Sadie watched with constant mild astonishment. She had known he was patient. She had seen it with animals, with difficult ranch work, with her father's occasional long-windedness. But she had not known how deeply that patience ran until she saw it applied to a small person who could not yet offer anything in return except noise and necessity. He was, she thought, watching him walk the length of the front room at 2 in the morning with baby Elias draped over his shoulder, exactly the father he should have always had. Spring came back around, and with it the second anniversary of the day Phineas Covington had ridden into Redemption Creek on a dusty black quarter horse and not looked at Sadie Bancroft. She thought about that often, in the pleasant retrospective way you think about the beginning of things when you are deep enough into them to see the full shape. She thought about Mrs. Finch and the post office gossip and the porch sweeping and the horseshoe competition and the spring in the north pasture, and the biscuit that looked as serious as it tasted, and the barn and the bandaged arm and the moment his face had opened. She thought about the parlor, and the door not quite closed, and the voice of a man asking permission. She was in the store on a Tuesday morning in April, with baby Elias in the basket behind the counter that she had set up in the first week of March when she returned to work, when Phineas came in, not on a supply errand. He had clearly come just to come in, and stood at the counter and looked at her with the expression that still, every time, made her aware of the peculiar luck of it, of having been the person this man chose to become fully himself with. "I was thinking," he said. "About what?" "About whether we need another hand at the ranch before the summer drive. Diego thinks yes, and I think probably." "You should hire one," she said. "You're always right when you agree with Diego." The corner of his mouth moved. "I've noticed that." He looked at the basket and at the small, sleeping face of Elias Covington, named for her father. "He slept past 4 last night." "A miracle," she said. "Possibly." He looked at her. "Are you well?" "I'm very well," she said, and meant it in all the ways it could be meant. He nodded, satisfied. He looked around the store for a moment. At the shelves her father had built, and she had organized and reorganized over the years, at the familiar smell of dried goods and wood, and the particular smell of a place that had been inhabited by purpose for a long time. Then he looked back at her, and she looked back at him, and between them there was no wall and no distance and no careful management of what was being revealed. "Good," he said. "Simple, direct, exactly him." "Good," she agreed. The years that came after that were not without difficulty, because no years ever are, and West Texas in the 1880s was not a country that permitted easy living. There was drought again in 1886 that cost them several head of cattle and required careful financial management of a kind that tried their joint patience considerably. There was a sickness that went through the town in the winter of 1885, which spared the Covington household, but took 2 people they knew and left everyone subdued for months. There was the matter of the expansion of the ranch in 1887, which involved a negotiation with a neighboring property that was so protracted, and so involved that it occupied nearly every suppertime conversation for 2 months, and eventually resolved in their favor by the narrowest of margins. And through all of it, the particular quality of their marriage, honest and direct and unafraid of difficulty, built on the foundation of 2 people who had each separately decided to fully show up, held. They had a second child in the spring of 1887, another boy, which Sadie greeted with a practical cheerfulness and Phineas with the same defenseless wonder that she had seen in him the first time, slightly more practiced now but no less genuine. They named the second boy Marcus, after no one in particular, but because they both liked the weight of it, and Marcus turned out to be quieter than his brother from the start, with his father's gray eyes and his mother's tendency to pay close attention to everything before forming an opinion. Elias Bancroft was at the supper table 3 evenings a week still, a little slower than he had been, a little quieter, but still himself in the essential ways, Still the man who had built a store with his hands and raised a daughter who could stop a panicked horse in the middle of a thunderstorm, and knew the difference between charity and neighboring. He was the one who told Phineas, one evening in the autumn of 1887, that the North Spring was running stronger than he had ever seen it. "Whatever those cows have been doing up there for 5 years," he said, "they've done it good." Phineas looked at Sadie across the table and she looked back at him, and they both understood the full range of what her father was and was not saying. "It's a good spring," Phineas said. "The best in the county," Elias agreed comfortably and helped himself to more bread. Young Elias, who was 3.5 and had recently discovered that he was capable of opinions, announced at this point that he did not want any more carrots, which redirected the conversation in the practical and grounding way that small children redirect all conversations. Phineas told his son with perfect seriousness that the carrots were non-negotiable, and the standoff that followed occupied the rest of the meal and ended in a compromise involving 2 carrots instead of 3, which Sadie recognized as her husband's negotiating pattern applied to the very smallest scale. She watched him and her father and her sons around the table, in the firelight of the house that had been an abandoned stone shell when Phineas Covington rode into Redemption Creek, and was now full and warm and inhabited by purpose. And she thought about the girl who had been sweeping the front porch of her father's store on a Wednesday afternoon in April of 1882, and had watched a man ride past without looking at her. And she thought about everything that had grown from that beginning. From the spring and the storm and the biscuit and the barn and the parlor door not quite closed, and she felt the full and unhurried happiness of someone who knows, without any question, that they are exactly where they are supposed to be. Later that evening after supper, after her father had ridden home in the autumn dark, after the boys were asleep and the house was quiet, she and Phineas stood on the stone step outside the front door as they often did, with the November stars sharp and numerous above the canyon, the same stars that had always been there, the same sky. "Phineas," she said. He was looking at the canyon rim. "I want to tell you something." He turned to look at her, giving her the full attention that she had learned over years to understand as one of his truest expressions of love, the willingness to fully stop and hear. "I overheard you," she said. "The night you asked my father for permission, I was in the hallway. I didn't mean to overhear, but I did." He was quiet for a moment. "Everything," he said, "most of it." He looked at the stars, then back at her. "Were you going to tell me?" "Eventually," she said. "I wanted to wait until it was something we were far enough into that it could be what it is, which is the most important thing I ever heard." He was quiet for another long moment. She watched his face in the starlight, the familiar planes of it, the jaw she had once thought looked like sandstone, the eyes that had once been carefully shuttered and were now, in the dark, completely open to her. "I was terrified," he said, "of asking him, of the possibility of asking and being found wanting." "I know," she said. "I've never been particularly good at the risk of being found wanting." "I know that, too." She turned to look at the canyon. "It was the bravest thing I've ever seen you do." He considered this. "Braver than fixing fence in a blizzard." "Considerably." He laughed, a real and full laugh that was still, after all this time, slightly surprising in the best way, and put his arm around her and she leaned into him. And the autumn night was enormous and cold and full of stars above them, above the canyon and the town and the spring in the north pasture, and the 2 sleeping children in the rooms behind them. And she thought that this specific and ordinary and extraordinary moment, was what everything had been moving toward from the very beginning. She had thought he was too proud to ever ask for help. She had been right about the pride. What she had not understood then was that pride is not the whole story of a person, and that a man with enough to love is capable of learning, slowly and with some resistance and with a great deal of grace, which is the hardest and the best way, that asking for what you need is not weakness. It is, in fact, everything. They stood there together until the cold drove them inside, And they went into the warm house and the sleeping children and the life they had built from a spring and a storm and a door not quite closed. And they were, both of them, entirely and completely home.